So, as I have admitted in previous sermons, I am an avid learner. Alyssa can testify to the number of times that we've been watching TV and she'll hear me mumble something like, "I wonder how submarines work," and then I'll just grab my phone and disappear down the rabbit holes of Google and Wikipedia. And as I was sitting down to start my sermon prep on Monday, which also happened to be Halloween, I realized that I didn't really know all that much about the history of All Saints' Day, where it came from, how it developed, and why it was so coincidentally close to Halloween. So this week I did a deep dive into the history. I read articles, I watched YouTube videos, I even consulted my official Lutheran handbook, courtesy of the Augsburg Fortress, just in hopes of better understanding, what today is really all about. So I hope that you'll indulge me in what will be part sermon and part history lesson. If you get bored at all, feel free to go write down the name of saints on those little slips of paper outside. Our story begins some 2,000 years ago with the ancient Celtic holiday known as Samhain, which was celebrated every year on October 31st and was the end of the harvest season. It also marked the end of the calendar year. So it was considered to be this liminal space in time, this time between years. They believed that the veil between the living world and the world of the dead was particularly thin at that time, so that it would be easier to communicate with spirits of the deceased, and there was even the possibility that some might try to cross over. They would build these huge bonfires and they would put out food for the spirits, and this celebration of Samhain spread throughout the British Isles and into Europe. Now fast forward a few hundred years, and we find that early Christians had started celebrating a similar holiday. Originally happening in May, All Saints' Day was a time to commemorate and honor the heroes of the faith, those who had died as martyrs. It was an opportunity to reflect upon what happens after our time here on earth and to seek guidance and wisdom from those who had gone before. Now, the early Christians must have had some fantastic people in their PR and marketing divisions, because when the expanding Christian faith collided with the existing tradition of Samhain, they didn't try to eradicate it right away. No, instead they were like, hey, we have a similar celebration, so why don't we just move All Saints' Day to be at the same time of year to help ease their transition into Christianity? So that's what they did. They put All Saints' Day on November 1st. Now, yes, this could be seen as a power move by the church, an attempt to appropriate or whitewash over their customs, and to some degree that's true. But I also see it as an example of the church being willing to meet people where they were, something that Jesus did for so many. Now, what's really interesting is that All Saints' Day was also referred to as All Hallows' Day. So, hallowed being another way of saying holy or saintly, which meant then that October 31st became All Hallows' Eve, the night before All Hallows' Day, and that morphed over time into Halloween. You can see I'm still totally geeking out, even as I'm telling you about this now. So anyway, All Saints' Day was officially established in the year 837. And then about 150 years later, in 993, they added a celebration that was known as All Souls' Day. That was put on November 2nd. That day was a chance to pray for all of the people that had died in the past year, especially those who, might not have been good enough to get into heaven right away and were just sort of hanging out in purgatory. Now, Luther's understanding of salvation sort of did away with our belief in purgatory and thus the need for All Souls' Day, but there are still some remnants of the tradition, like how we read a list of the beloved members of our community that have died in the last year. And the modern-day practice of trick-or-treating is thought to be derived from a practice of people going from door to door to ask for soul cakes, these little baked treats in exchange for saying prayers for those who had died in order to help get them into heaven faster. Although there is a competing theory that says it developed from a practice of playing tricks on your neighbor that Irish immigrants brought to America, and that treats were given out as a bribe to avoid property damage. So basically, trick-or-treating started out as an extortion racket run by kids to get candy, which I think is fantastic. So given all of the shifting over the years, and especially with the changes that were brought on by the Reformation, one of the other things that I was confused about was who it is exactly that we are celebrating. When I say that word saint, what kind of person do you think of? I think that most of us would probably think of someone who is a particularly good or faithful person. A person who displays all of the qualities that are listed in the second half of our gospel reading for today. Someone who loves their enemies and does good to those who hate them. A person who will give you the shirt off their back and always turns the other cheek. A person who is virtuous and holy. The word saint actually comes from the Greek word hagios, which means consecrated to God, holy, sacred, and pious. Historically, we might think of people like Mary, Jesus' mother, or Francis of Assisi, who we'll be remembering later today with the blessing of the animals. Both of them, along with countless other saints, were considered to be these beacons of morality. They stood as examples for us to follow. Miracles also come to mind for me when I think about saints, usually related to a healing of some kind, but not always. In my research, the best story that I came across was that of Saint Denis, who was a bishop in Paris. He was executed by having his head chopped off, but that didn't stop him from his mission of sharing the gospel. No, instead, he is reported to have picked up his own head and walked for several miles while preaching a sermon on repentance. So, Yeah, there's a statue of it, so it had to happen, right? That's how that works. So that leads me to the last thing that I think of when we talk about someone being a saint. We're usually talking about someone who has died. But Martin Luther, who I hear made a pretty spectacular appearance last week, would disagree with pretty much every requirement that I just listed. In Luther's mind, each and every one of us is a saint. If you look at how the New Testament uses that word saints, we see two important things. First is that living people can indeed be called saints. Paul does it all the time. He calls all sorts of people saints in his letters. And second, being called a saint has nothing to do with what that individual person has done. It has nothing to do with how many miracles they have performed or the length of their heavenly resume or how many times they've let someone merge in at the last second, despite the fact that you waited in line like you were supposed to and they just drove up alongside you and wanted to butt in. None of that matters. I'm getting snaps from the back. I appreciate it. Being a saint has nothing to do with what that person has done. Instead, it has everything to do with what God has done in and through the person of Jesus. We are made holy, sanctified, made saintly, not because we have earned such a glorious distinction and title through our efforts, our good deeds, or our pure ways of living. Rather, it comes to us as an unmerited free gift of grace that is bestowed in love through the salvation and redemption of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Jesus' love and grace and forgiveness, those are the things that make us holy. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's all fine and good to say, Pastor Sam, but I don't feel particularly holy. I try to live a good life and be a good person, but I'm no saint. A saint certainly wouldn't have said what I said to that guy who cut me off in traffic the other day. And that's fair. Because interestingly enough, the bestowing of that sainthood on each of us doesn't negate or eradicate our humanity. our shortcomings, the ways that we mess up or fall short. In my section of who we consider to be saints that I talked about a little while ago, I neglected to talk about one category of people, those who are promoted to sainthood by their own families when they die. As soon as the person has passed away, suddenly they become a saint like no other. To hear people talk about them, you'd think that they had been flawless and perfect in every way, bestowed with every good and gracious, wonderful character trait known to humanity. It gets to the point where those who actually knew the person in real life begin to wonder if we're really talking about the same person or not. My family tries not to do that. Now, certainly we are respectful and loving, but we also try to have a realistic memory of those who have departed us, one that remembers and celebrates all of who they were, the good, the bad, the morally questionable. My mom's father, Papa, as I called him, who passed away in 2009, comes to mind. I loved him very much, and he was a good and funny and loving man who also bent the rules from time to time. One of our favorite stories to tell about him happened when I was like 3 or 4 years old. We were walking out of the grocery store, and my mom looked down at me, and I was suddenly wearing these bright lime green sunglasses. You know, the ones where like the shaded part can flip up? And she looked at me and she said, "Where did you get those?" And I said, "Papa gave them to me." And now my mom turns to look at her father. She didn't need to say anything. She just needed to look at him. And he said, "What? I found them on the ground. There was no price tag, so I thought they were free." And he was right. There was no price tag. There was, however, the little plastic ring that the price tag would have been attached to, but there wasn't an actual price tag. All my mom could do was sigh and tell him, not for the first time, that she could never in good conscience be a character witness for him, should he need it. She also loves to tell about how he would go for walks while they were at their family lake house in Indiana, and he would come back with a fresh bouquet of flowers for her mother and a bag of tomatoes, both of which had been picked from the yards of unsuspecting neighbors along the route. I could go on and on, but I won't, because even with all of his character flaws and occasional petty crimes, Luther would still say that my grandpa was a saint, and the same is true for us. Simul ustus et peccator, the Latin phrase that gets translated as simultaneously saint and sinner. Luther believed that we are indeed made holy and pure, sanctified, while at the same time remaining the same flawed, broken, imperfect, and in need of salvation human beings that we always have been. And while it might seem contradictory or counterintuitive, this both and way of thinking is a much more accurate and honest way of describing our experience of God's grace. And it's also deeply Lutheran, because life is so rarely either or, black or white, but rather it comes to us on a spectrum, in a beautiful array of colors, and we need a theology that can speak to the nuanced nature of our existence. There is something that changes about us when we hear the good news of Jesus, when we hear about how we are loved and how we are made in the image of God. It heals and soothes so many of the wounds that this world can inflict. It inspires us to respond with generosity and love, not because we are trying to earn it, but because the overflowing of love is just the natural response to such abundant grace. And yet, despite all of that, we will still fail. We will still fall short. We will still respond at times in ways that are greedy, selfish, mean, short-sighted, tight-fisted. Despite all of that, we will fail to live into the vision of who God has that we can be. And while our saintly nature does not obscure or wipe out the truth about our sinfulness, the opposite is true as well. There is no amount of falling short or failing or messing up that will ever strip us of that divine love, that will ever render us unworthy of God's grace, that will ever call into question our sanctified nature. For we are all saints and we are all sinners. So in the end, All Saints' Day really has quite the rich history and many different meanings. It is an opportunity to give thanks for and remember our loved ones who have passed on. It's a time to reflect upon the lives of the faithful who have come before us, to ponder how we might imitate or be inspired by them. And it's a time to recognize the holiness that exists within each and every one of us. A holiness that is there not as a reward for anything that we have done, but as an indelible sign of God's unending love for us. A love that persists and remains even when we mess up, even when we live in less than saintly ways. So blessed are you, dear saintly sinners of God. Amen.